In the previous part, we explored 4 types of cheese considered excellent companions for health after age 60, from classic Parmesan to aged Gouda, from raw cheddar to Swiss Gruyere. Each one has stood the test of time not just for its flavor, but for its real biological value to the adult body, especially for older adults. But nutrition has never just been about what you add in. Sometimes what matters more is knowing what to cut out. Because certain foods, seemingly harmless, even so familiar they've become fridge staples, can actually be the silent Achilles heel of senior health. And in the world of cheese, this is no exception. In this part 2, the elderly way will help you identify 4 types of cheese that people over 60 should avoid as soon as possible. Not because they're some kind of toxic food in a sensational way, but because at this age, your body can no longer handle excess sodium, industrial fats, synthetic preservatives, or hidden additives as easily as it once could. What used to be just a snack can now become a hidden trigger for high blood pressure, chronic inflammation, memory loss, or even stroke. And the surprising part is, you may have eaten one of these 4 cheeses just this past week without even realizing it. They're easy to find, come in eye-catching packaging, and are often promoted as convenient sources of protein and calcium. But the truth behind them is very different. If you're serious about maintaining long-term health, keeping your mind sharp, your body mobile, and your independence intact, then knowing what not to eat is just as important as knowing what to eat. So if you found the elderly ways insights in the previous part helpful, this section may be even more practical. Stick with us until the end of the video, because the worst cheese on this list could raise your stroke risk by as much as 80%, and knowing that today might help you avoid an unnecessary danger tomorrow. If you're watching, don't forget to hit like so YouTube knows this content is valuable, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the other topics we'll be bringing your way. And especially if you have loved ones, friends, or peers who eat cheese every week out of habit, share this video with them. One smart choice today could change the entire decade ahead. Now, let's get started. This is part 2 of the video. 4 types of cheese people over 60 should avoid. Number 4. Processed cheese slices, convenient on the outside, risky on the inside. No one can deny the convenience of individually wrapped cheese slices that fold easily into a sandwich or melt quickly over a hot burger. For many older adults, this may even be a familiar go-to choice from decades past. But if you look closely at the ingredients list and understand how they're made, it becomes clear that this is not a food that fits into a healthy diet, especially after age 60. Processed cheese slices contain less than half real cheese. The rest is a blend of softening agents, emulsifiers, preservatives, artificial colors and flavors, and inorganic salts, especially sodium phosphate, a form of sodium that is rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream. Just 2 slices can contain over 600 mg of sodium, which is more than 25% of the recommended daily limit for older adults. This sodium level isn't just a blood pressure concern. Studies have shown that sodium phosphate can accelerate cellular aging, damage the kidneys, and stiffen blood vessels, especially in people with underlying health conditions. Beyond sodium, synthetic emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose can disrupt gut microbiota. Preliminary studies in both humans and animals suggest these substances increase the permeability of the intestinal lining, leading to what's known as leaky gut. When this happens repeatedly, it can trigger chronic systemic inflammation, the underlying cause of many age-related diseases, from neurodegeneration to metabolic disorders. It's also worth noting that these cheeses often contain artificial colorings like yellow 5 and yellow 6, which have been questioned for their potential links to hyperactivity, allergies, and neurological effects in sensitive individuals. The preservatives that help them last for months, such as natamycin or sorbic acid, are FDA approved but not harmless if consumed over time, especially when they alter the already vulnerable gut microbiome in older adults. One unfortunate fact is that these products are often advertised as high in calcium or good for bones. In reality, their protein structures have been damaged by high heat and pressure processing, destroying natural digestive enzymes and making nutrients harder for the body to absorb. Some even contain trans fats, a type of fat proven to raise bad cholesterol, lower good cholesterol, and cause inflammation. Even if the label says 0g trans fat, US. Law allows rounding down to 0 if the amount is under 0. 5g per serving, meaning that if you eat multiple servings, the trans fat can still add up significantly. All these factors, when accumulated over time, can create a biologically harmful environment for older adults, increasing the risks of high blood pressure, lipid disorders, insulin resistance, and cognitive decline. There's nothing wrong with eating a slice of convenient cheese in a pinch, but relying on them daily, especially as a main source of protein, is something people over 60 should think twice about. Number 3. Processed cheese spread: soft, creamy, easy to eat, but not healthy. Cheese spread is often seen as a more comfortable choice compared to sliced or block cheeses. You can buy a tub, store it for weeks in the fridge, and easily spread it on bread, crackers, or even steamed vegetables. With its smooth texture and mildly salty taste, this type of cheese is especially popular among older adults because it's easy to swallow and digest. But here's what most people don't know. To achieve that long-lasting softness, the food industry has sacrificed much of the nutritional value and replaced it with ingredients that raise serious health concerns. The first thing to note is that cheese spread is rarely made from real whole cheese. Most of it is a blend of refined vegetable oils, usually soybean or palm oil, modified starch, processed milk proteins, thickeners, preservatives, and artificial flavorings. In many products, partially hydrogenated oils are still used, the source of artificial trans fats. These are the very fats the World Health Organization has called to eliminate from the global food supply due to their direct link to heart disease, endothelial inflammation, and abnormal blood lipid levels. Even when a product is labeled trans fat-free, many manufacturers substitute with interesterified fats, a chemically altered fat designed to improve shelf stability. Although still under study, preliminary data suggest that these fats may disrupt blood sugar metabolism and negatively affect liver function. The sodium content in cheese spread is also alarmingly high. Just 2 teaspoons, a small amount if you're spreading it on 2 slices of bread, can contain 500–600 mg of sodium, which is nearly 1/3 of the daily recommended limit for older adults. This sodium doesn't just come from table salt, but also from sodium-based preservatives like sodium citrate, sodium phosphate, and sodium aluminum silicate. These can cause water retention, elevate blood pressure, and put stress on the kidneys, especially in people with chronic kidney disease, diagnosed or not. Another concern with cheese spread is the use of artificial flavorings and taste enhancers like monosodium glutamate, MSG, or its variants under names like yeast extract or natural flavors. In some sensitive individuals, these can trigger headaches, nervousness, and mild digestive issues. For those taking medications for blood pressure or neurological conditions, prolonged accumulation of these additives could lead to unpredictable imbalances. Lastly, a less publicized but critical issue is the potential exposure to phthalates, a group of plasticizers commonly found in soft plastic packaging. Some studies have shown that these chemicals can leach into fatty foods like cheese spread, especially when stored for long periods or under fluctuating temperatures. Phthalates have been identified as endocrine disruptors, linked to reproductive issues, metabolic disorders, and even an increased risk of cancer in long-term studies. All these factors turn what seems like a harmless, friendly food into a potential source of long-term health risks, especially for older adults, who are already vulnerable to metabolic disorders, high blood pressure, and chronic inflammation. Cheese spread may not cause immediate harm, but regular use over months or years could contribute to a gradual health decline that catches people off guard. Instead of using industrial cheese spread, consider a healthier alternative. Mash real cheese, like aged Gouda or grated Parmesan, and mix it with a bit of Greek yogurt to create a smooth blend. This not only adds beneficial probiotics, but also gives you more control over the ingredients and nutrition. Number 2, pre-shredded cheese in bags, convenient but at the cost of quality and safety. There's no denying that pre-shredded cheese saves time. Just open the bag and sprinkle it over salads, pizza, or pasta. No knife, no grater required. But behind that convenience lies a string of nutritional and safety compromises that consumers, especially older adults, are rarely warned about. To keep the shredded cheese from clumping together in the bag, manufacturers often add anti-caking agents like cellulose, an indigestible fiber usually derived from wood pulp, or modified starches such as potato starch. While these additives aren't toxic in the conventional sense, they interfere with the cheese's ability to melt and coat properly. They can also cause digestive issues in people with sensitive stomachs, a common trait among seniors. Adding cellulose not only lowers the cheese's nutritional density, but also hinders the body's absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, vital for bone health and immune function. In addition, to extend shelf life and prevent mold, many pre-shredded cheeses contain antifungal agents like natamycin. Though it's a naturally occurring antibiotic, regular consumption can alter the gut microbiome, which already tends to lose diversity with age. A disrupted microbiome can lead to digestive problems, weakened immunity, and even affect the gut-brain axis, which plays a role in mood and cognitive function. Another concern lies in the quality of the ingredients. Cheese produced on a large scale for shredding and bagging is often made with lower-grade milk than block cheese. That milk typically comes from sources with higher levels of antibiotics and hormones due to cost-cutting and productivity demands. This results in differences in fatty acid profiles, CLA content, and essential micronutrients. There's also the increased risk of bacterial contamination, which many people overlook. When a block of cheese is shredded, its surface area increases dramatically, exposing it to more air and environmental bacteria. The moisture in each shred creates an ideal breeding ground for microbes if the product isn't stored correctly. Several recalls of shredded cheese in the U.S. have occurred due to contamination by Listeria or E. coli, bacteria that are especially dangerous to seniors, pregnant women, and people with weakened immune systems. On top of that, the shredding and industrial packaging process tends to raise histamine levels in the cheese. Histamine is a natural compound that, in sensitive individuals, can trigger headaches, dizziness, rashes, or digestive upset. For younger people, this might be a minor annoyance. But for older adults taking blood pressure meds, antidepressants, or antihistamines, dietary histamine can lead to more serious and complex side effects. Finally, from a cost perspective, pre-shredded cheese is typically more expensive per gram than block cheese, yet delivers fewer nutritional benefits, more risks, and a blander taste. This is a clear-cut case where consumers are paying for convenience by sacrificing quality. If you're looking for a convenient way to enjoy cheese without losing its nutritional value, the simple solution is to buy cheese in blocks and shred it yourself when needed. This lets you avoid unnecessary additives and ensures better freshness, meltability, and flavor, while also reducing the risk of long-term chemical buildup in your body. Number 1. Blue cheese, bold flavor, hidden risks. Blue cheese is one of the most distinctive and iconic cheeses out there. With its blue or grayish-green mold veins running through each slice, it often appears on appetizer cheese boards, upscale restaurant salads, or as a bold accent in gourmet dishes. However, its visual and taste appeal comes with a range of biological factors that make it one of the riskiest choices, especially for people over 60. The first thing to note is that blue cheese is made by introducing Penicillium roqueforti mold during the aging process. Although this mold strain is recognized by the FDA as safe for use in food, it is still a live mold capable of producing small amounts of mycotoxins, microscopic fungal toxins. While these levels are strictly regulated in industrial production, frequent consumption or eating expired cheese can lead to the buildup of mycotoxins in the body, which can be especially problematic for older adults with weakened liver or kidney function. On top of that, blue cheese is one of the highest tyramine foods. Tyramine is a naturally occurring compound formed when proteins break down during long fermentation and aging. It is known to cause sudden spikes in blood pressure, severe headaches, or anxiety in sensitive individuals, especially those taking MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which are still prescribed to some older patients with depression or Parkinson's. In the worst-case scenario, tyramine can trigger a hypertensive crisis if improperly combined with certain medications, requiring emergency intervention. In addition to tyramine, blue cheese also contains very high levels of histamine, 5 to 10 times more than other types of cheese. Roughly 1–3% of the population is histamine sensitive, and eating blue cheese may lead to vague but persistent symptoms like chronic headaches, rashes, itching, diarrhea, or even unexplained insomnia and anxiety. In older adults, these symptoms can easily be mistaken for other medical conditions, leading to misdiagnosis and ineffective treatment. The high sodium content is another issue. Just 1 ounce of blue cheese contains around 400–450 mg of sodium, and because of its intense flavor, people often consume more than they would with milder cheeses. Excess sodium doesn't just raise blood pressure. It also causes water retention and puts extra strain on the heart and kidneys, especially in individuals with a history of coronary artery disease or mild heart failure. Furthermore, the primary saturated fat in blue cheese is palmitic acid, a type of fat known to provoke inflammation more strongly than other saturated fats like stearic acid. Studies have shown a link between high palmitic acid intake and increased risk of atherosclerosis, as well as endothelial dysfunction, both closely associated with cardiovascular disease. One final but significant risk is the potential to confuse good blue cheese with spoiled blue cheese. Due to its naturally strong and sharp smell, many people fail to detect when the cheese has been contaminated or has gone bad. In older adults with weakened immune systems, this increases the risk of severe food poisoning, especially if harmful bacteria are not properly neutralized. All of these factors don't negate the culinary value of blue cheese, but they do raise serious questions about how suitable it is for daily consumption in seniors' diets. If you're a fan of this cheese, it's best to enjoy it occasionally, in very small portions, and only if it's been properly stored and is clearly within its expiration date. But if you're looking for a cheese that's not only safer, but also supports heart, bone, and brain health, blue cheese should be replaced with healthier alternatives mentioned earlier. You've just completed the journey of discovering 4 types of cheese that people over 60 should avoid as soon as possible. Not because they're immediate enemies, but because after 60, our bodies no longer handle excess sodium, emulsifiers, preservatives, and industrial fats the way they used to. Those convenient cheese slices, tubs of spreadable cheese, bags of shredded cheese, and even blue cheese, while they may look harmless and familiar, carry hidden risks that quietly build up day by day. From high blood pressure and chronic inflammation to memory issues and strokes. What's alarming is that most of us have no idea we're regularly consuming these risks with every meal. And that's exactly why this video was created. Not to scare you, but to hand you a magnifying glass, helping you see more clearly what's in the food you eat and how each small choice affects your health every single day. At this age, you don't need extreme restrictions. You don't have to give up all the foods you love, but you do need to know what's worth keeping and what it's time to let go of. A simple change, like cutting out a type of cheese that no longer suits your body, can make a big difference, easing the burden on your heart, sharpening your memory, and helping you take control of your future. And if you found value in what you just watched, I hope you'll hit the like button, not just to support the video, but to help the YouTube algorithm spread this message of healthy living to more older adults. Don't forget to subscribe to the Elderly Way channel and turn on the bell, so we can continue walking this journey with you, covering upcoming topics on nutrition, metabolism, memory, movement, and more. If someone comes to mind, a loved one, a partner, an old friend who still regularly eats the cheeses we just talked about, please share this video with them. Sometimes, the right video at the right time can be the most meaningful health gift you ever give someone. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a comment and let us know, which type of cheese do you eat most often? And if you've ever improved your health by changing your diet, share that too. Your story might be the inspiration someone else needs. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, living long isn't about luck, it's about making the right choices, starting with the smallest ones.